The real reason the United States invaded Iraq. In March of 2003, the United States launched one of the most controversial military operations in modern history. American forces crossed into Iraq with a clear message. The world was told that Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction, chemical weapons, biological weapons, and possibly the ambition to build nuclear weapons. The warning was simple. If Iraq had these weapons, they could threaten the entire world. But years after the invasion, after thousands of lives were lost, after the occupation of Iraq, those weapons were never found. So the question still echoes across history. If weapons of mass destruction did not exist, why did the United States invade Iraq? To understand the real reasons behind the war, we need to go back several decades, because the story of the Iraq War did not begin in 2003. It began during the Cold War. In 1979, Saddam Hussein officially became the president of Iraq. He ruled the country with absolute authority. Political opponents were imprisoned, rebellions were crushed, and the regime maintained tight control over Iraqi society. But despite his authoritarian rule, Saddam Hussein was not always considered an enemy by the West. In the early 1980s, Iraq was fighting a brutal war against Iran. The Iran-Iraq War lasted 8 years, and it became one of the deadliest conflicts of the 20th century. More than 1 million people died, cities were destroyed, and both nations were pushed to the edge of collapse. At the time, Iran was seen by the United States as the greater strategic threat. After the Iranian Revolution of 1979, Iran had become openly hostile to the United States. So during the war with Iran, many Western nations quietly supported Iraq, not necessarily because they trusted Saddam Hussein, but because they feared the expansion of Iranian influence in the Middle East. For a time, Iraq served as a counterbalance, a barrier against Iran. But the relationship between Iraq and the West would soon change dramatically. In 1990, Saddam Hussein made a decision that shocked the world. Iraq invaded Kuwait. Kuwait was a small country, but it possessed enormous oil reserves. Control of Kuwait meant control of vast amounts of global energy supply. Within hours of the invasion, the international community reacted. The United Nations condemned Iraq, economic sanctions were imposed, and a military coalition began to form. In 1991, the United States led a coalition of more than 30 countries in a military operation known as the Gulf War, RNA, Operation Desert Storm. The war was swift. Within weeks, Iraqi forces were pushed out of Kuwait. But despite the military defeat, Saddam Hussein remained in power in Iraq. The United States chose not to remove him from office. Instead, Iraq became one of the most heavily sanctioned countries in the world. Throughout the 1990s, Iraq lived under severe economic sanctions. The country's economy collapsed, infrastructure deteriorated, and millions of Iraqis suffered under the restrictions. Meanwhile, United Nations inspectors entered Iraq to search for weapons programs. Their mission was to ensure that Iraq was not developing weapons of mass destruction. But tensions between Iraq and the international community continued to grow. Then everything changed on September 11, 2001. The terrorist attacks against the United States transformed American foreign policy. Nearly 3,000 people were killed, and the American public demanded security. In response, the United States launched what became known as the War on Terror. The goal was no longer simply to respond to threats. The new strategy was to eliminate threats before they could emerge. This concept became known as preemptive war. And in the years following September 11, attention increasingly turned toward Iraq. American officials argued that Saddam Hussein could not be trusted. They believed Iraq might possess weapons of mass destruction, and there was fear that those weapons could fall into the hands of terrorist groups. In 2003, the United States, in a coalition of allies, launched a full-scale invasion of Iraq. The military campaign moved rapidly. Within weeks, Baghdad fell. The Iraqi government collapsed, and Saddam Hussein went into hiding. Months later, he was captured by American forces. He was found hiding in a small underground bunker near his hometown. For many, it appeared that the mission had been accomplished. But the situation in Iraq quickly became far more complicated. Insurgencies began to emerge. Militant groups attacked coalition forces. Sectarian violence spread across the country. Instead of stability, Iraq descended into years of conflict and instability. Thousands of American soldiers lost their lives. Hundreds of thousands of Iraqis were killed. And the region entered a period of profound uncertainty. Meanwhile, investigators continued searching for the original justification for the war, the weapons of mass destruction, but they were never found. Years later, intelligence reports revealed that the information used to justify the invasion had been deeply flawed. Some evidence was inaccurate, some intelligence was misinterpreted, and some claims were simply wrong. So once again, the question returned. If weapons of mass destruction were not the real reason, what was? Many analysts believe the war was driven by a combination of factors: strategic influence in the Middle East, control over one of the most oil-rich regions in the world, and the desire to reshape the balance of power in the region. Others argue the invasion was the result of fear. A nation traumatized by the attacks of September 11th, determined to prevent any future threat. The truth is likely far more complex. The Iraq War was not caused by a single decision. It was the result of politics, strategy, fear, power, and flawed intelligence. More than 2 decades later, the consequences of the war are still unfolding. The Middle East was permanently reshaped. New conflicts emerged, and the global balance of power shifted. Today, historians, analysts, and policymakers still debate the true motivations behind the invasion. But one thing is certain: the Iraq War became one of the defining geopolitical events of the 21st century, and its lessons continue to influence international politics to this day. The real question now is not just why the war happened, but whether the world has truly learned from it.